A lot of different kinds of personalities and experience levels are going to be listening to this introductory podcast. It must be noted from the outset that I do not seek to preach at or try to convert anybody who is not yet willing to accept or even consider somewhat unorthodox ideas, such as that playing the piano has almost nothing to do with playing the piano, that trying to follow a method will never replace discovering and carving your method, or that the fingers can do what the mind can imagine them doing, and the fingers cannot do what the mind cannot imagine them doing. Of course, these points and many, many others will be discussed and expanded upon throughout the series. So for those of you who are genuinely curious to discover more about your musical personality, the mind, body and piano components of water pianism, and how to identify and maintain your path, not to mention over 100,000 words of other content, allow me to introduce what it means to follow the path of becoming and hopefully remaining a water pianist. Water pianism is a state of mind. It is not a method. It cannot be described in one sentence and is very difficult to believe in during the initial stages of its discovery, because the ego will be blocking out anything new, unusual, or which goes against its firmly held belief systems. The water pianist does not study, apply, seek, or eventually teach any existing or particular method. They have achieved the mindset of removing restrictive labels and recognized that exactly what is required to be a pianist already exists within. From the moment they first sat at a piano and pressed their first note, all the way to their first live performance of a Chopin nocturne, a Liszt etude, a Beethoven sonata, solo jazz improvisation, or their own compositions. Not once does water use force, yet it still exists in a constant state of motion. Most interestingly of all, water is not conscious of a final destination. Indeed, what would it do once it had arrived? What freedom, what pleasure, what ease! Such is the state of mind of the water pianist. The series is divided up into 3 categories, this episode being the isolated introduction. The first is entitled The Philosophies, the second, Theory and Technical Exercises, and the third, Jazz and Composition. Where necessary, piano samples are present to enhance the discussion by way of demonstration, with the first category, due to its nature, having the fewest samples. To reject the first category is to reject water pianism, and to deny yourself the opportunity of discovering your method and enjoying the unimaginable benefits that these provide. Water pianism has 3 components, each to be dissected further in the philosophies category, but which I should expand upon a little here. Water pianism has 3 components, each to be discussed further in the philosophies category, but which I shall expand upon a little here. The mind, the body, and the piano. More often than not, traditionally, this sequence instead begins with the piano, meaning theory and technical exercises, repertoire. Sometimes discusses the body in terms of posture, fingering, physical health perhaps, but rarely goes near the mind. This is how the majority of piano educators were trained, and how they then pass on the baton, and so it continues. As a water pianist, however, you will strive to become a master of all 3 components equally. But interestingly, as you may have realized, 2 of them do not need a piano in order to be mastered and maintained. Because of this, you will hear me use the catchphrase at and away from the piano very, very often. In fact, the water pianist spends time practicing and mastering all of the various components more so away from the piano than at it, which is very unusual. But why this is will become more and more understandable as you become more au fait with the philosophy and with yourself. The majority of this podcast series will encourage you to apply your mind a lot more away from the piano than being at it, applying your fingers. And this is where your ego may get involved. How can I learn the piano without playing it? I need to feel the keys so my accuracy improves. To learn the piano away from the piano isn't going to help me at all. Well, with such poisonous thoughts from the ego and a total disinterest in even considering the potential of water pianism or the power of your mind, what such a person fails to realize is that even if they did spend 100% of their time at the piano and did not work on either of the other two components away from it, and sometimes at it, their playing would be far below what would otherwise be possible for them. As I expand on in great detail, mastery of only one component is simply not enough. Even two falls short. The piano component may well involve such vitally important elements as touch, interval accuracy, and scale, chord, repertoire fingering, but the piano does not teach patience. It does not listen to the inspirational source, which is something to be discussed a little later as part of the mind component. It does not know your musical personality. It cannot tell you correct posture. It alone cannot enhance your endurance. It cannot improvise for you. It cannot make you play in time. It cannot memorize chord progressions for you. It cannot teach you to read musical scores, etc., etc., etc. The piano component, in fact, is the smallest of the three components, because without a mind mastered and a body maintained, the piano component is rendered somewhat meaningless. The piano is simply a reflection of that balanced mind and strong body. It is not the source or cause of it. The water pianist understands this, so does well to achieve much success with the other two components, primarily away from the piano, by putting at the piano component elements last, which does not mean rejecting them. In other words, the water pianist's life, as I like to say, is 90% away from the piano and 10% at it, 1% for each finger. There are 4 internal philosophies that will serve you well to master whilst working on the mind component: the internal jukebox, the internal piano, the internal metronome, and the internal manuscript. The internal jukebox represents the fact of how one can replay repertoire from beginning to end in the mind and know every beat, every instrument, every lyric, every note of the melody, every chord change. If not by name, then you at least know one has taken place. Thus the whole structure. If you don't know your repertoire by heart in your mind, you simply cannot play it at the piano. As a water pianist, you will know to master a piece, even several versions of it if they exist, which is often the case for jazz piano repertoire or interpretations of classical repertoire, before even thinking about looking at, then studying the score or heading to the piano to what would most likely be an unsuccessful attempt at learning the piece in question. This is regrettably often a source of abandonment for many a student. Your internal piano travels with you everywhere. If you don't think you have one, or don't think you can have one, you are wrong. The internal piano will feature significantly throughout this podcast series because on it you will refine, enhance, render more fluent, and practice many piano component concepts before sitting down at the keys. The internal metronome refers to your body's natural ability to keep in time. I have heard and read countless times that someone doesn't have a sense of rhythm, or that no amount of training can help, or even that one is born with or without a sense of rhythm. The fault lies in the terminology here. Rhythm is not metronomic steadiness. So it is true that one may not feel rhythms very well, but the internal metronome philosophy refers to steadiness in execution, no matter the rhythm, no matter the time signature, no matter the tempo. It is the inherent tick, 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 which is accessible to anyone who is mastering the mind component and is related strongly with the teaching of patience. Now, once a song has been perfectly transferred to your internal jukebox, it is of course going to be eventually time to look at the sheet music. For jazz, this may be looking at only chord symbols and a one-note melody, collections of which are known as fake books. For classical music, a lot more is needed, from understanding various dynamic markings, pedal use, not to mention the obvious exact note values to play in both hands so as to execute the piece exactly as written. Either way, but more so for classical or precisely scored repertoire, reading music is a necessity. Using the internal manuscript philosophy, one is able, anywhere, to practice sight reading. This series will provide opportunities to practice exactly this, away from the piano. A very exciting aspect of water pianism is that you are encouraged to go on a destinationless journey of self-discovery. You may already be a very good piano components player, with good dexterity, accuracy, and a large repertoire, yet have never discovered truly your musical personality, natural fingering, natural limits in technical exercises, emotional connections with chords and intervals, which affect your improvisation and composition style, should you ever wish to venture down those paths, or how much conscious interference exists when you perform. I've lost count how many times I've had this kind of conversation or online exchange, but when they have been enlightened to these ideas, much truth rushes forwards, and they go on to reach previously unimagined joy and skill levels, both at and away from the piano. They become water pianism ambassadors. If I may share a little more about the mind component, which will be primarily a philosophical discussion, we will cover such topics as overcoming negative influences of the ego, the illusion of hand independence, patience, the mind triangle, the internal piano, metronome, jukebox and manuscript philosophies, fear of spontaneity and improvisation, musical personality and its dissection, the fallacy of grades, conscious interference, stage fright, listening externally and internally, how to acquire repertoire easily thanks to analytical dissection and pattern recognition, the practorments philosophy, exertoires, feeling rhythm, and a variety of thoughts, realizations and wisdom to keep you on your path towards becoming a water pianist. Piano teachers and unpersonalized method books enforce set pieces, which are often disliked for a variety of reasons, even if considered beneficial. In music, if you find a piece boring, you will not want to learn it, no matter how beneficial it is deemed to be. The point is, there is always another way, your way, and that is what water pianism puts first. By following your path, just like with water, obstacles will be seen as part of the way, your way, and not perceived as boring or restrictive, making you want to give up. Because one never gives up when on their true path, and that is only discoverable through mastery of the mind component, which cannot take place solely at the piano. As with nature itself, the tiniest components have been perfected so that the result, as a whole, looks effortless. It could be said that nature revels in the tiny. So, upon observing a flower, for example, it would be almost impossible to count the tiny actions taking place out of sight, which all give rise to what we call a flower. To add just one extra layer to this philosophy, the smaller components, as I shall refer to them, are specific to each flower, with every water pianist being unique in natural ability, age, ambition, musical personality, life experience, hand span, dexterity, etc. The smaller components of each water pianist are just as unique as well. For this very reason, it is your task to identify what is unique to your path and master it. For example, a teenager with concert pianist dreams would be mastering very different aspects of music theory and technique compared with, let's say, a 60-year-old who wants to play 80s pop and rock repertoire in a pub band on weekends. Remember to acquire what you need when you need it. Water Pianism refers to this as the dissection philosophy, and it will be discussed in more detail later on in the podcast series. Maybe something that you have never considered in great detail is your musical personality. Knowing what you like is one thing, but knowing why in theoretical detail, as well as what you don't like in theoretical detail, is another. This goes even further into knowing what chords and intervals you like, even which accented beats give you a better feeling than others. Awareness of such things results in more suitable repertoire selection, more natural improvisation if you take that path, and a better idea of your compositional style should you take that path. Not to mention how you actually play the piano itself when external influences are no longer a concern. Often, people detest the boring music a teacher or method book presents, and they end up abandoning the piano altogether. Or the music they want to learn is believed to be too advanced or beyond your current grade. All of these are, of course, utter nonsense, because through simple dissection combined with mind and body component mastery, anything is possible. And Water Pianism will encourage you to accept nothing less than this fact until you at least achieve your musical ambitions. As you will learn from the episode on the mind of the water pianist, you will then share your abilities of mind, body and piano component mastery in your own little and great ways. Another thing we will discuss is the debilitating obstacle of conscious interference. In short, it refers to the fact that the human mind can only focus 100% on one task, and that each time a task is added, concentration is divided and divided and divided until the number of tasks requiring conscious application cannot be juggled and the execution of all tasks fails. Playing the piano has up to 20 possible conscious demands, obviously because of 10 fingers, but we also have to think about pedal work, chord and scale shapes, remembering the structure of the piece, the melody, the next chord, timing, perhaps listening to other musicians or following a conductor, sight reading left and right hand parts, etc. It only becomes daunting when you think about them rather than letting them occur by themselves and achieving the pinnacle state of water pianism, to become a spectator to your hands. Now, I know that this may provoke you, but understand that I am not saying everything just happens without any study or practice, and I'm not saying repetition isn't useful, but I am saying that eventually you will reach a point where those things will happen by themselves, as if you have given them the freedom to happen by themselves through you. It comes down to this. The more you master the three components of water pianism, the less they interfere with your natural flow. A calm, balanced and controlled mind component is apparent in practice and performance. A strong, maintained and healthy body component is apparent in practice and performance. A well-educated, technically proficient and graceful piano component is apparent in practice and performance. For every episode involving mastery of some melodic phrase, chord progression, scale or technical exercise, you will be reminded to identify first and foremost your natural limit. This philosophy is absolutely foundational to the water pianist. To find one's natural limit, simply set up a metronome and execute the required task at a speed at which no mistakes are present. Even better is to do this with your eyes closed to further reduce conscious interference. Do not be one of those who says it's more difficult with eyes closed. Well, slow down the speed of the metronome even further until you can do it with eyes closed. Then speed up through repetition, at and away from the piano where possible, until you can do it at least at the tempo required. Pushing beyond it won't be detrimental, should you be curious as to how fast you can go. Just don't forget that speed acquisition comes from slow, precise practice with as little conscious interference as possible and is built up at your natural pace. Becoming impatient only means you need to work a little more on the mind component away from the piano, because impatience leads to frustration, and this has no place in the mind of the water pianist. Do not expect the theory and technical exercises category to be a repetition of what can already be found online. The theory provided is known as unavoidable content, and it's theory which applies to everybody, no matter their path, with encouragement for you to explore online and book resources for topics in further detail which apply to your path. The jazz and composition category exists for those of you who are interested in playing the piano primarily without reading music. You will learn how to notate chords, play extensions, apply modal theory to improvisations, become familiar with jazz terminology such as a lick, sharing fours, changes, upper chord structures, turnarounds, some new scales, floating 2-5-1 philosophy, etc., and be directed to popular recordings and jazz musicians, not only pianists. This category is full of piano samples to embellish the text. Expect many philosophies as well, of course, and do not think for a second that jazz is not something which requires mastery away from the piano as well as at it, because it absolutely is. A lot of jazz education, unlike classical piano, is in listening to the greats of all instruments and identifying traits and really getting the swing and groove into your bones. Water pianism says that jazz is spontaneous improvisation and composition is notated improvisation. The discussions on composition will present the common elements of composition, including things such as structures, chord progressions, typical piano styles of more modern compositions, in particular the monotonous 1/5 octave left-hand technique, the emotional center, a lot of listening recommendations spanning hundreds of years using the inspirational source, etc., etc. I will also share some or parts of my own compositions purely for discussion, dissection, demonstration, or general interest. Amongst the piano and body component topics, I will discuss how the chromatic scale gives us major scales, which give us chords, naming those chords and understanding what inversions and extensions are, voice leading, how to build any scale from the major scale, including minor scales, applying dynamics to touch, bringing two hands together as one, correct posture, energy puddles and the energy channel, improvising not only in the jazz sense, some ear training but with emotional connections, not just dry interval guesswork, neglected practice techniques, some actual repertoire analysis and acquisition, if only for practice, should you not like the piece in question, things the left hand can do in terms of accompanying the right hand, finger dexterity ideas, discovering natural fingering, eyes closed experiences, common scale and chord techniques, arpeggios, grace notes, etc., modal theory, the circle of fourths, common chord progressions, sight reading tips, including your internal manuscript, finding your natural limit, note value awareness, physical body exercises, accuracy ideas, finger independence exercises, endurance tips, and many other things I have compiled based on past conversations, the huge amount of comments my videos have received, obvious difficulties for most people, as well as tendencies and trends of beginners, even experienced pianists who are missing certain aspects from any of the three components. I also occasionally call upon my own memories, preferences and experiences. In saving the best till last, for those of you who have made it this far, water pianism is an exercise in personalization, self-mastery and service. Recognize that as a water pianist, you have a responsibility towards seeking and staying true to your own path without neglecting, rejecting, or judging the paths of others. As a representative, you are gentle, pleasing to the ear, and unassuming, both at and away from the piano. Your goodly nature, refined touch, and overall demure are sure to have positive, unspoken effects on those around you. You will have become part of the great purpose which I have worded and adhere to myself as follows. Seek seekers and those sought to help spare the unsought. Thank you for listening, my good friends.